Hi, everyone. Welcome to this year's third and final Fellows in the Field event. I'm Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Every year, the center selects fellows from a broad range of disciplines and backgrounds, including law, higher ed, social science, and technology. These fellows receive funding to conduct research that will further the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. The Fellows in the Field series is an opportunity for members of the higher education community, like you, to dive deeply into the research of the fellows and how it can be applied to your day-to-day work on campuses. And today, we'll be tackling not just one, but two interesting and provocative topics studied by last year's fellows, art and porn. Lynn Comella is a professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and she utilized the campus flashpoint of pornography in order to develop best practices and policy recommendations for strengthening speech and academic freedom initiatives. Professor Comella is an award-winning researcher and expert on the adult entertainment industry. She's the author of Vibrator Nation, How Feminist Sex Toy Stores Changed the Business of Pleasure, and co-editor of New Views on Pornography, Sexuality, Politics, and the Law. She's the former co-chair of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Adult Film History Scholarly Interest Group, and her research has been featured nationally and internationally in outlets that include the New York Times, Washington Post, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Sydney Morning Herald, and more. Amy Werbel is a professor of the history of art at the State University of New York Fashion Institute of Technology, and she analyzed freedom of artistic expression, or lack thereof, at academic museums and galleries. For the past 20 years, Amy's research has concentrated on censorship at the intersections of law and culture, and particularly in relationship to freedom of artistic and sexual expression. Her most recent book, Lust on Trial, Censorship and the Rise of American Obscenity in the Age of Anthony Comstock, was awarded the 2019 Peter C. Rollins Book Prize of the Northeast Popular and American Cultural Association. Professor Werbel has lectured nationally and internationally on the damaging impact of censorship, not only on artistic expression, but also on pluralism and democracy more generally. It's so wonderful and fun to have you both here, two people whose work I really admire and also just really like. So we're going to be focusing on how Amy and Lynn's work intersects. But before we get to the intersection, I want to invite each of them to share an overview of their research and findings, and I'm going to let Lynn kick it off.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Amy. And hi, folks who are zooming in from all over the country and perhaps elsewhere. It's always hard to do an overview in a short amount of time, but I will do my best. So, as many of you know or can, suspect, pornography has historically been a lightning rod for a variety of cultural anxieties, as well as a flashpoint for campus controversies. And professors who study and teach about the history of pornography and sexuality more broadly are often on the front lines of debates about academic freedom and campus free speech, serving as what one person I interviewed described as a test case and an inspiration for teaching material that some find challenging, others controversial, and still others fundamentally obscene or unsuitable for the college classroom. So I was really interested in kind of looking at sexual speech broadly, including faculty who teach about sex media and, pornography as well, and really kind of using it as a case study to better understand what's involved in teaching difficult and controversial material and what that suggests about the limits of academic freedom on college campuses at a time when higher education is increasingly under attack and new forms of censorship are being codified into law on what seems like almost daily basis, or at least it did last spring. So I really want to underscore the case study aspect of this. It's looking at pornography, but I think what my research results signal really dovetail with, what people who are teaching about critical race theory, people who are teaching about race and the history of racism are also experiencing. And I saw anecdotal evidence of that resonance the first time that I presented preliminary results from my research, that the people who were nodding their heads in the audience kind of, most vociferously were folks that were teaching not pornography, but other challenging topics. So what I did in the spring was I conducted 24 in-depth interviews with faculty at universities in the United States, faculty from across the country. They were public institutions, private institutions, religious institutions. I talked to folks with tenure, without tenure. I also interviewed folks who were contingent faculty. And I was really interested again in kind of, shedding some light on the lessons that battles over sexual speech and pornography, what those lessons are and how we might be able to use those lessons to actually strengthen free speech policies and initiatives more broadly on college campuses. So I want to say real quickly, I think sometimes it's easy to brush off pornography as not being very culturally redeeming or significant. Why does it matter? Why should we care about this? And there's many reasons I could get into, but I think the one thing, since I'm limited with time, I want to underscore is if you look at the rationales that are being put forward across the country by parents and politicians who are attempting to ban books, it often gets reduced to this is pornographic. This is pornographic content. We want to kind of take these books off the shelves. So I think it's really interesting how kind of seemingly malleable the term of pornography is and the ways in which it easily gets mobilized to kind of be articulated to anything that folks find personally objectable or related to sexual expression, desires that fall outside of what Gail Rubin describes as that charmed circle of heteronormativity. So I think even though I'm talking about what's happening on college campuses, in my research project, we see the ways in which this nexus of gender and sexuality are being mobilized in a number of different arenas currently. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I want to be conscious of time. So I really found a lot of things that I found personally kind of interesting in the course of conducting this research. And I guess where is my notes here? Sorry about that. So the themes that emerged were, kind of the various forms of labor, for example, that are involved in teaching difficult and potentially controversial topics, including the emotional labor that a lot of faculty expend to anticipate and manage student responses, the politics of trigger warnings and safe spaces in the context of Me Too, the lived reality and the kind of emotional toll of academic precarity, which people really elaborated on in my interviews. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the effects of institutional gatekeeping and censorship, including how faculty engage in practices of self-censorship. That's really the final one is the theme that I focused on. So I just want to kind of pull out one section of my research results to talk about. And I want to say that, a particularly striking example from my interviews about the ways in which certain kinds of words, required readings or images and films, how they might shock or offend in unexpected ways was when a professor shared a story that parents launched a complaint against him with an academic office because he showed the 1980s R-rated film Flashdance. And some parents felt that was pornographic and offensive, and what is this teacher doing teaching this? And I use that example because if we have a 1980s film like Flashdance provoking these kind of outraged response, it signals how challenging it is for faculty who are actually kind of teaching about the history of pornography and screening these images and hardcore images and films. So in a climate in which students are being encouraged by conservative organizations to play gotcha by video recording their professors and posting these videos online, and when disgruntled students are taking their complaints about professors straight to media outlets, faculty are really more cautious than ever about the topics they teach, what readings they assign, and what films they screen. And one thing I found, and this is why I'm highlighting this, is that I found in my research that professors are increasingly avoiding hot button issues that maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago they had no difficulty teaching. They're so cautious right now. There's so much self-censorship that is happening. And others report that they have simply stopped teaching certain films, stopped assigning certain books or texts because they can no longer accurately engage student responses. So what I found is that faculty are slowly whittling away at their syllabi, and they're removing content that just a few years ago they were teaching without issue or pushback from students. The climate has changed very quickly for them. This is especially the case, it seems, with books and films long considered to be part of the queer studies canon. A number of professors discussed occasions in which LGBT-themed books and films, quote, just kind of blew up in unexpected ways, giving them pause to ever teach them again. So in wrapping up, more than one interviewee felt that even the more progressive students were becoming more conservative when it came to their willingness to engage with sexual media or sexuality in general. Rather than embracing sexual transgression and freedom as liberation, as they once did, some faculty are witnessing what feels like a generational shift on the part of their students to a more protectionist ethos in which they expect to be shielded from anything they perceive to be harmful, triggering, or traumatic. It's thus increasingly difficult for professors to assess student expectations and adequately manage their effective responses. One professor I spoke with, who regularly teaches classes on the sociology of sexuality, told me that she once had a teaching assistant who reported that every time the professor used the word penis in class to talk about the human sexual body, they were triggered. Some professors acknowledge that while their capacity for empathy has increased over the years, so too has their sense of self-inhibition. In some cases, this has contributed to them moving away from teaching courses that involve sexuality and sex media altogether because the classes have become simply too fraught, too frustrating, too exhausting for them to successfully and confidently navigate. So I'm going to leave it there. I have a lot more I can say, but I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And it's going to take all of my self-restraint not to ask you some follow-up questions, but I am going to encourage folks who are participating today, you can put questions and answers into the Q&A, and we are leaving substantial time to get to those. But without further ado, I'm going to now turn it over to Amy, who's going to paint us a picture, not to use a bad pun, but of the landscape at university museums and galleries when it comes to expression.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, Lynn. I've been learning with you guys for a year and a half now. It's been an absolute delight. And I'm still using my UC National Center for Free Speech mug every day. So it's wonderful to be with you. And I wanted to first share a little bit just about my project and about what I learned about academic art museums and galleries. And the first really important thing to convey is just that they are incredibly diverse. They are as diverse as our higher education landscape. And I always like to think of the big picture that I taught in China for a year. And, all the higher education there is a branch of the culture ministry of the Chinese Communist Party. We have the opposite of that. We have just institutions, large and small, public and private. During my fellowship year, I interviewed and surveyed more than 100 curators and directors at public and private institutions, small and large colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, one tribal college, R1s, liberal arts, secular universities, and Catholic and Christian colleges. I really tried to do a broad sweep of that overall landscape of higher education. And then to look at different types of campus museums and galleries. And we have to remember they are just all over, literally all over the map in terms of their size and their scale and their scope. Some campuses have an art gallery that is in the art building, and it primarily just serves the students who are taking art classes, exhibiting work by students and faculty members. And then on the other end of the scale, you have some large research universities that have multiple museums with different focuses, freestanding buildings that are serving not only the academic audience, but also the community. I spoke with some curators at art museums that serve the entire state. They were bringing in school groups from all over the state. And then there are some that have international audiences as well. So they're enormously diverse. Some of them really face inward and some are public facing. Exhibition ideas can start with campus staff, but they also often start with students and faculty members. There are guest curators and there are juries. What I was really interested in was how the decision-making process changed when art was considered for exhibition that might be provocative. And that's a big kind of might. Like, you don't always know what is going to be a flashpoint, right? And so who was in the decision-making position just normally? That was a question I started with. Who, where do the ideas come from? Who decides what gets to be seen on campus? And then when something was flagged as potentially problematic, then what happened? And who got to decide then? I didn't use the word censorship. I used constraint. When are constraints placed on exhibition of art? Because I think people think of censorship as being, just they think they know what it is. But in the context of curating, there's a very, slippery slope because curators make choices mostly, right? About I'll exhibit this, but not that, or, where to put things all the time. And so I was interested to not have that word kind of get in the way of people just telling me what goes on in their institution and how things are working and what is being shown and what isn't. One thing that is uniformly common in all of these art museums and galleries is that decision makers, curators and directors see freedom of artistic expression on campus as critically important. 78% said essential and 22% said very important. So that's 100. Nobody said not really important. Many of them talked about the Campus Art Museum as a place to bring people together to talk about difficult but important topics that can be seen in new ways through conversations about artworks. Art has this almost unique ability to be, seen from multiple perspectives. And so you can really get a conversation going about a topic as seen through the lens of an interesting, maybe innovative framing that an artist has provided. Many of the people that I spoke with also felt that they could take more risks in academic galleries as opposed to other types of museums, because they typically don't have to worry about audience revenue streams, which your typical municipal art museum may need to bring in X number of, ticket sales to pay the security guards. And most academic art museums and galleries are not funded that way, although some do have revenue streams from ticket sales. But it's not that common. And essentially, they also told me that they felt that they had more freedom because they could grab onto the idea of academic freedom, even if they didn't really know what that meant, legally or practically or functionally, that they were guided by the ideal of academic freedom extended to their campus art museum. And when it came to exhibiting the work of art students, people overwhelmingly wanted to support the development of the students, right? That's what higher education exists. One of the main functions of higher education is helping students explore new ideas, explore themselves. And so this is a good segue to when things get difficult, which is that student art sometimes creates controversy. One thing that many people said to me, there's always someone who wants to exhibit like a 6-foot tall penis, and it's in multiple media. Like this is just like part of the job. And they're just kind of used to that. And only about half, that I guess it's cup half full or cup half empty. Half of people said that they never put any constraints on the exhibition of art. It's just whatever students want to exhibit, or faculty or guest curators or their own staff or themselves, they just put it up. But the other half of the people said that, yes, it was common, for example, to use content warnings. So maybe that big graphic nude might go around the corner and it might have a content warning, or the content warning might be outside the gallery, or it might be outside the museum. So that was the most common kind of constraint. And then some people also spoke about making special process, like they would make it hard for a student to do, like there was a student who wanted to do a nude performance. And so they said, all right, well, you're going to have to jump through a variety of hoops and write a paper about what you want to do this. And then ultimately the student didn't do it at all. So provocative art might get a different, kind of paper work process. And then another really common thing is just, as I mentioned, putting something potentially controversial in a less visible space. If you have a nook or cranny in your gallery where it's not the first thing people see when they come in, that's also really common. When I asked what kind of content triggered this kind of special treatment or any kind of special treatment, the most common answers were, dovetailing with Lynn, graphic sexuality, nudity, racial stereotypes, supporting democratic politics, colonizer perspective, artists' known views or actions are problematic. And that actually comes up fairly frequently. Somebody is just like, an artist has political views or has said things that are viewed to be really controversial, and then people don't want the art exhibited. And then painful historical subjects. And one of the most surprising and disheartening results of my survey was that while only, as I mentioned, half of the people that I spoke with reported that they had placed constraints on the exhibition of art in the past, when asked what they expected in the future, many more said that they expected increased constraints on the exhibition of art in coming years. And I think that may be because at the time I was researching, gag orders, divisive content laws, as Lynn mentioned, critical race theory bans, and book banning was just sort of at the start of what has now been, in the past year, kind of an explosion. So I think people were seeing these headwinds. So I'll leave it there. And hopefully that's a good overview.
It's a great overview, and already the questions are pouring in, and it ends up that one of the questions from Eric works perfectly with one of the next questions I was going to ask both of you, which has to do with basically navigating state and institutional politics and sort of what things maybe can be done to avoid falling into, and I'm reading from the question, the trap of self-censorship, especially in cases where employees may feel a form of pressure to avoid talking about issues like this. So Eric's question is really getting to the heart of what are we going to do about it? And so I think I'll just cut to the chase and say, I was going to ask Amy and Lynn about all the internal and external pressures, but I think that we can, by going to the recommendations for how to respond to those pressures, we can kind of answer Eric's question and talk about what people are facing. I don't know, Lynn, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's such a great, timely question. The self-censorship is really rampant. And the people, some of the people who've been at the vanguard of porn studies are opting to just stop teaching the class altogether because it's not worth the institutional, headache or potential blowback or just kind of navigating kind of students who are kind of, not engaging or not happy with stuff. I so much of my research, people had such kind of different, varied institutional experiences in ways that you might expect, right? Like, what state are they located in, right? I interviewed people in Florida. I interviewed people in Georgia who are watching, tenure whittle away, queer film instructors in Florida who are trying to navigate don't say gay bills and DeSantis restrictions on higher education. People in Florida who have literally watched colleagues be run out of academia because a title of their published book was seen as inflammatory. And then folks in California and Oregon. So a lot of different state politics, institutional politics. And I would say, what folks are grappling with is their deeply felt commitment to teaching these topics which can be controversial, which can be challenging, with kind of not putting a target on their backs, right? So they're trying to find ways to navigate these institutional and state politics in ways that allow them to do what they want to do and what they were hired to do in many cases, to be clear, and also fly under the radar. So there's just a lot of creative maneuvering that takes a lot of strategizing and a lot of emotional labor, right? From like, how do you present your course topic to your chair or your dean? What title are you kind of choosing? You know, someone told me that when she went to her department chair with the title for a graduate student independent study on feminism and kink, the chair was like, that's never going to make it past the kind of checks and balances that the state oversight committee has in place for curricula. So she just renamed it Feminism and Sexuality. So one of the big challenges that I saw in my research was the fact that there are simply not conversations that are happening at colleges and universities around these issues. There's not any kind of foundation that's being set to talk about academic freedom and free speech. Faculty aren't having those conversations. Administrators certainly aren't having those conversations. And so repeatedly, people in positions of power are being caught completely flat-footed. You know, they don't have a kind of campus-wide discourse that exists, and they certainly don't have a plan of action of how to respond when a controversy arises, which is a real kind of shame, because we're going to be seeing more controversies, you know, and as we have over the last, you know, several years. So I would say, you know, almost everyone I talked to told me this was the first time they had ever had a conversation about these institutional challenges. They're out there every day, every week doing this work, and no one, even within the disciplines, are talking about these issues. So I think, you know, if we want to talk about strategies, it's really like going back to basics. That's what I found in my research. Going back to basics, like, you know, having forums, you know, encouraging kind of, you know, graduate students and students you're mentoring, when they interview, when they have their campus visit, ask about what kind of policies and practices are in place to, you know, protect academic freedom, normalize those conversations, and like start kind of setting the bar higher for what you expect from your deans, from your provosts, from your college presidents. So, I mean, the kind of normalizing conversations about free speech and academic freedom, it seems so very, very basic, but trust me, it is just not happening. So that's like a good starting point.
Thanks so much, Lynn. You guys couldn't see it, but Amy is vigorously nodding her head as Lynn is talking. So, Amy, I'm imagining
yes.
You'd like to add some things about how to navigate institutional challenges.
Yeah. Well, I also wanted to acknowledge the questions that I can see from Lawrence. You know, experience or practical advice do you all have any experiences or practical advice on creating a space for open dialogue and ensuring speech is not silenced while acknowledging the need for trigger warnings or disclaimer in context? And I think actually the curators and directors and you know, that I spoke with are really skilled at that. And they're, you know, let us do what we do, which is that we know how to do interpretation. We know how to bring in diverse panelists to share different perspectives on works of art. As an art historian, I lead students through discussions of like, let's not talk about subject matter right now. First, I want to talk about some of the artistic choices that this, you know, painter, photographer, whatever has made, so that, you know, all of the expertise that we bring to the table, it's not just what we're teaching, it's how we're teaching it, right? And so often these conversations just get flattened into what's the title of a book, or, you know, was the N-word in there somewhere? You know, I've seen people get in trouble for teaching James Baldwin, you know, and often those same things translate into works of art as well, right? Same kinds of flashpoints can be embedded. So some of my kind of best practices that are all, you know, in my report, which I know it's long, but it's really worth it. But one of those things was kind of like it takes a village kind of thing that curators talked about. If work might be provocative, they would be ahead of time. Usually exhibitions are scheduled way in advance, getting professors to sign up to bring their class, to maybe give a talk about it. They would be bringing in different organizations from the community. If it was something like something related to Me Too, and there might be, violent imagery included, but bringing in people from, domestic violence organizations to talk about what was going to be included in the show and why, explaining the point of view of the artists, having artists on board talking about their work, so that when the pressure came, there was already this village ready to say, wait, this really has value, and look how it's being used on campus, or maybe as part of our, building relationships with community. So that really being able to articulate the value of why you're teaching what you're teaching, why you're showing what you're showing. And as absolutely, I could not nod my head more vigorously with, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we are losing. It's not like pornography isn't a massive factor in the lives of our young people, really affecting sexuality broadly and globally, and helping change and shift this, inextricable part of our human existence. So if we are, what are we losing when we're not having conversations about difficult subjects? And really importantly, supporting the idea of pluralism. Another great thing that I heard, and I think this happens a lot, right? A professor's provocative, or a particular course is provocative. It's not required, right? You really get into trouble when it's like the foundational, like if everyone at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas campus had to take porn studies, right? It would be a different thing, right? But it's not that way. And just saying, look, you don't have to like everything we teach. One curator I spoke to, who was in a very conservative Southern town, she said that over years, she had built a relationship with the museum patrons and community members, which was like, you're not going to like everything we show. Sometimes the students want to address topics you're not interested in. And she exhibited lots of LGBTQ art, exhibitions on racial violence, and the conservative audience members would just say, you know what, I'll see you later. Like, I'll come back when you're doing that landscape show in the spring. And that's a conversation she had with them over and over again, is you may not like this, but don't shut it down, right? We are pluralistic institutions. Everything's not for everyone. I have some more tips, but I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that all of it is great. And I think also, like you're saying, not just the value of what's being taught, but the value of having something that you're uncomfortable with be in a museum or in a class. I want to turn to two questions that were sort of related from John and Rebecca that have to do with sexual harassment policies in Title IX, and sort of this idea of, are those becoming weaponized in a way that it is making it harder to protect teaching the kinds of things that you have been teaching, Lynn? I'll start with you.
So I have not personally kind of had that experience. And perhaps surprisingly, Title IX really didn't come up that much in my interviews with sexuality scholars and porn scholars. Now, the kind of impact of Me Too movement did come up, particularly came up from kind of male sexuality scholars, and the ways in which maybe, some of the things that they taught and their pedagogical practices and how they taught, they've really become more self-aware, more mindful of the kind of politics of the classroom in a kind of, this era. So that has come up. So it is kind of interesting. I mean, I feel like, the data that I collected doesn't really speak to Title IX being weaponized. I should say that. Now, why that is, I don't know. It's anybody's guesses. But what people did mention, and what was definitely on their radars across a number of interviews was the kind of potential for the conservative student to enroll in the class specifically to kind of play gotcha, to take out the phones, to video record with the intention of putting it on social media. So I think that's interesting, right? Like, people didn't say that they were concerned about a Title IX complaint. Nobody did. But what they did talk about was their concern of going viral. That was their big concern, right? And that was particularly a concern, for people who were maybe doing a 1 or 2 week unit on pornography in a history of film class or in a history of media studies class, where it's a more general education or all the majors are required to take it, right? So it's not a specialized elective that people are necessarily opting to teach, but they're doing this 1 or 2 week module because they firmly believe that you can't talk about the history of film if you're not going to talk about pornography, because it was just that important to the history of film. So there is this sense of knowing that it's a little bit of a gamble, that they don't want to go viral, but they could go viral, and they're trying to read the room and gauge, the extent to which their room is filled with allies. Are people friends or are they foes? And it's not always easy to tell these days. So people were much more concerned about the potential for students, interestingly enough, to go directly to the media with a concern than they were, at least in my interviews, voicing concern with someone going to the Title IX office. Now, there were certainly concerns about people going to the chairs or parents calling. Those were concerns. But Title IX, interestingly, didn't come up that much for whatever reason.
No, thank you for that. And I don't know, Amy, if you want to add anything on Title IX, but I have a sort of different thing I wanted to ask you about, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
Or do you want to add something about Title IX?
Well, I was going to say that the Title IX office, when I went through that, okay, who gets added to the conversation if the work might be provocative, I thought the Title IX officer might be higher up, but really far below, like the provost, external relations, the PR people, alumni relations. I don't think in academic administration, Title IX officers have a seat at as many tables as people think necessarily, but it wasn't sort of, again, that like Lynn, people weren't really talking about that much, but I wanted to talk about this fear that people have of what happens if. And going back to some more of my takeaways is that we need to be proactive. People should know what will happen if, like, I'm teaching this, here's some content that should be just widely understood, communicated with the dean. These are the things we teach. It should be on department chairs to basically say, these are the things that we're teaching, and then to have a plan with external relations and alumni relations and all that kind of thing, so that everybody's talked about these things before they happen, and that at the beginning of that conversation is academic freedom and valuing expertise, valuing that professors teach what they teach. It's not just about the content, it's about the way we teach it, the training that we have, and the experience that we have to shape and frame conversations that, usually it's like 1 or 2 students who complain, but then the rest of the class will weigh in and say, you know what, I'm learning a lot and I really love this class. It's a very typical scenario in these kind of dramatic situations. So both things have to go together, that administrators are saying, I value your expertise, and this plan is going to be, 9 times out of 10, or maybe more, hopefully more, we're going to have your back because you are explaining to us the value and the purpose and the, context of what you're doing. And that's what we articulate. And I use this phrase, not asking permission, but giving a heads up, because the responsibility for curriculum rests with faculty. End of story. It's, AAUP guidelines. It's in our union contract, which we can talk about the value of unions and tenure, endowments, endowed positions. That's the secret sauce I found most correlated with a curator or director saying that they felt they had freedom to take risks. They had tenure, they had a union, their museum was endowed, and their funding couldn't be threatened by politicians. So I will stop there.
Imagine that job security increases people's willingness to take risks. Well, and I think that's an important finding in light of the chipping away, as both of you mentioned. One of the things, Amy, that your research also showed was that people were actually predicting increased self-censorship in the future. And I just sort of wanted to talk about, how we respond to this sort of feeling that I know I've heard from many people of sort of despair and sort of hopelessness. And again, I think it goes back to what can be done, but how do we break down these really kind of large systematic issues so that we can, start to try to turn the tide?
Well, I think we each commit to doing what we can in our own sphere and also taking advantage of opportunities to build that village, create that network, reach out by talking about the erosion of academic freedom in its many, many, many dimensions, the attacks. And I saw Lawrence had asked about red states versus blue states. And believe me, I was looking for that. I had a bunch of questions, and it really didn't work that way because college campuses are such microclimates. And a lot of people that I spoke with, and this is heartening, they felt like they really were able to, have exhibitions that raised important topics that students wanted to talk about, and that in their own particular campus environment. And this crossed some religious institutions, public institutions in conservative states. There's so much diversity out there. And I started out by talking about that's something to be hopeful about, that I think things are working in many places still, where people aren't feeling the same kind of pressure that is certainly evident and rising everywhere. But I think the hope, well, for me, art always gives me hope. And our students give me hope because they have their lives ahead of them. And it's our obligation to preserve as much academic freedom and freedom of artistic expression as we possibly can for the sake of our children and our students and, just the generations ahead of us. So I always like to say, I think we've bottomed out. I think now it's really going to start coming back, but we need to look at I like to say the marketplace of ideas takes place within a marketplace. And right now the academic marketplace is really threatened. And we need to take care of some basic problems, which are we need to bring back more full-time kind of tenured faculty into the mix. And we need to basically say, brand managers are not the decision makers regarding curriculum, regarding what we exhibit on campus, that people who have public relations expertise are great. We're happy to have you here. Stay in your lane.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just chime in really quickly, about the red state, blue state. I definitely saw that, right? Because people were very much, responding to what at the time was that rapidly unfolding legislation that was being passed in the moment when I was doing some of these interviews. So there really was, people very conscious of kind of pressures coming from the legislature, and different states kind of have their histories with kind of, legislative overreach, for example. So I did see that breakdown, although certainly, everybody I interviewed was feeling some kinds of pressure. They weren't necessarily all the same. What I will say is I think having conversations like this is really, really important. I think that is one of the things that can give people hope. I mentioned this already, but I'll just, say this again. And that is that, people I talk to, for the most part, were feeling really isolated in their experiences, which was surprising to me because I was interviewing a lot of people who are actually part of a kind of close-knit community of pornography scholars and sexuality scholars. But there's this sense that, some people experienced, and they were mainly women who experienced the worst treatment of being doxxed, of being having to have campus security stand outside their classroom door. I mean, some really extreme stuff that we read about, but then to hear it from people it's very bracing. But even feeling like I was talking to people who I think of as being part of a scholarly community, when they were experiencing the worst harassment or a Twitter crusade launched by an angry parent about a course someone was teaching, even though their child wasn't in the course. They felt like they didn't have anybody to turn to. So I think that, it's important to think of, having these conversations at our institutions, but also having them at the level of our professional organizations, having them at our general business meetings, if there's a sexuality interest group or a porn studies or adult film history interest group, and building that community, building that support system professionally amongst our scholarly communities, in addition to building that institutionally. And again, some of it's happening, but not really. And the degree to which people said, oh my gosh, this is the first time I've ever talked to anybody about this. I'm so happy to have this conversation. One person I interviewed ended our interview by saying, thank you so much for conducting this interview. It felt like therapy.
Wow. I just want to add before Amy has, I'm sure, more to say, just talking even about the levels that Lynn was talking about, but also adding in the importance of connecting what happens in higher education to the world outside the academy. And I think about this as we get ready for the midterms, and we're doing a lot of our pushing and getting people registered to vote, right? That we need to explain to people, like what Amy and Lynn have been saying, what's being lost and what the value of it is. And not only for the students in the class, but why people who aren't at the university at that moment, or maybe never have been in university, why they need to care. And I think that's even an additional challenge, right? Because in some ways, I was talking with a student yesterday who reminded me, like, all politics is local, right? And that includes what's happening at your school board or in your higher education institutions. Mm-hmm. So Amy, did you have more to say? Otherwise, there's another question I could ask, but.
No, go ahead.
Okay, Carlos had a question. He writes, increasingly, I'm encountering the accusation that certain types of research teaching exhibits are a form of epistemic violence. And how did the two of you address these kinds of concerns? It's a hard one.
I haven't come, and this is to answer, I think, a strain of questions that have come. There's no question that the pressures on faculty and curators and directors are coming from the left and the right, mm-hmm. and from administrators and from students. It's hard not to feel just sort of in this sort of vice grip of griping, where it's hard to. And I think that's part of the exhaustion that people face right now, the reason more of these conversations aren't happening. And I just want to say what a relief to be a fellow at the UC National Center. And I send people to the webinars, to the resources, to the research reports, because the research that the UC National Center is doing is creating that go-to list of best practices, and also hopefully documents like Lynn's report and my report that can be a starting place for a conversation. And that's really what I was hoping as I was, writing it up, is that, for people in the field to talk about this, and to talk about it with administrators, and to talk about it with students, and to kind of reframe what some of the issues are. And when I see a phrase like that, epistemic violence, I see something that I think reframe. I would ask my students, let's take that couplet apart. Like, what exactly do you mean? What would be an example of that? Because when I see that, I think about sex trafficking. I think about genocide. I think about people being blown up in Ukraine. You tell me what in my class sounds like that. That's where, again, that's the expertise that professors have to take a conversation, present content in a nuanced way. I will guarantee you, it can't happen on Twitter. It happens in the classroom space. And that's what, we were talking about. Somebody said that the campus art gallery is like a sacred place. because you can look at especially interesting work of art, a complex work of art for a long time and keep seeing new things in it and have a conversation because people will see it in different ways. Mm-hmm. So the only way that conversation can't happen is if the artwork isn't on display, right? So that is, I think, a way to take something like that and not respond to it, or respond to it by asking a series of questions, of getting at the heart of what the person means and getting a conversation to be what it should be in higher education, which is nuanced and complex, at least in the humanities, right? We don't answer the questions, we raise more questions. So yeah, that's how I would answer that. Yeah. Thanks, Carlos.
I mean, I don't know if I really have anything to add, in terms of Amy's answer about, that particular question posed by Carlos. But I mean, one of the things that I take from Amy's answer is just this kind of ongoing discussion, ongoing conversation, ongoing education. And my interviewees talked about and took seriously their role in educating their colleagues, educating their department chair, educating their dean, and so on about the inherent value of what they do, right? So it's a lot of pedagogical labor that it kind of exceeds the classroom, right? The boundaries are kind of boundless. And I would say that, I want to make sure I get this in here because I want to say that one of the most surprising themes that emerged in my research, and one of the most interesting themes that I hadn't thought about in advance, was that a number of my interviewees talked about the public relations, media relations offices at their universities as being one of the most powerful institutional gatekeepers, that they were the ones kind of, metaphorically speaking, shadow banning certain faculty, shadow banning certain areas of study. People shared with me, for example, of, sitting for interviews that they had been asked to do with public relations people. And then those interviews were never put up on the website because, we're a little worried about, what you study, or we're a little worried about the title of your book. So there was a lot of frustration directed at media relations professionals within the institution who were really micromanaging people's profiles, people's academic profiles, not signal boosting their books, not signal boosting their courses and their publications. And basically, I had people say that, they've been at their institutions for 20 years. And, last year was the first time they were ever allowed to go to a donor event. That they had basically been kept in a corner and out of sight because there was a perception that what they did, despite being, an award-winning scholar, was too potentially controversial or scandalous. And this person said, this is ridiculous. These donors were fascinated to hear about my research. They were interested to hear about my research. They wanted to hear more about my research. So again, that I bring this up because the education is ongoing and it is needed in places that might not be entirely obvious at first glance.
Yeah, and I would just add that in so many of these instances, as I found as well, something becomes controversial, and all of a sudden, the curator who has a PhD, or a Master of Museum Studies who is trained to do the work is overridden by somebody with, in the public relations office. And that's censorship right there. That is censorship when the expertise is overridden and they're being told, to get rid of something. And I will also say, and it's something I really wanted to talk about, is that when those situations go up to legal always says you have to exhibit the work. That's it, because the case law supports exhibiting the work, especially in public institutions. And getting back to that question of professional development, the people that I spoke with didn't know their rights at all, didn't know the, First Amendment law regarding freedom of artistic expression on campus, but legal knows, and so I think it would be really great to have professional development at the American Alliance of Museums, at the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries, even just to help people articulate, why are we leaving that up? Well, we're leaving that up because in the United States of America, we value freedom of expression. We value a pluralistic conversation. We're not making you see it. You can ignore it, but you can't ban other people from looking at this work that you don't like. We have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, which are, we're not going to show, big nudes to school children. But we're also going to support content and viewpoint neutrality. I mean, these are legal concepts that I think if people were introduced to them, they could really use them in explaining why they're showing what they're showing, that we're not taking that student work down. For these reasons. And when I looked to see where that professional development was happening, nowhere. The answer is nowhere. So big opportunity for someone out there. I'm really busy right now, but to develop these webinars and programs for curators and directors.
I was going to say it's very rare in a webinar that lawyers get like a positive shout out. So yay, lawyers. Of course, I am one, but I want to echo that. I think the truth is that the more people understand what the First Amendment does, and not just what, but why it's important, the more buy-in I think that we can have. And that's obviously one of the missions of the center, is to do education. And as Lynn said, back to basics. I knew that this conversation was going to go fast. It flew by. I'm really grateful to both of you. We have two department chairs here who are both exceptionally busy, whose fellowship ended months ago. I appreciate your being here. I imagine that people may reach out to you, and I hope they do, to continue to learn more. And I just want to say that I'm grateful to both of you. And I will just end by, kind of mentioning, the midterms are fast approaching, and with them sort of the evergreen topic of fostering democratic values, many of which Amy and Lynn just touched on, and learning in higher education all year round. And so on November 16th, after the midterms, we're going to have 4 civic experts engage on this conversation of beyond voting, nurturing democracy on campus. In the meantime, I hope everyone's getting ready. Next week is Free Speech Week. And I hope you'll look forward to our next podcast, which is going to be on state legislation geared at dictating what is permitted and prohibited from being taught in K through 12, higher education, and access to information. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you soon.